Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. We'll get started. I'm Jocelyn O'Zolins from the Shelter Island Library. A little bit about Lynne Weikart. Professor Weikart has held several key positions in government, including budget director of the Division of Special Education in New York City Public Schools and executive deputy commissioner of the New York State Division of Human Rights. She's the co-author of 2 books, Budget Tools, Financial Methods in the Public Sector, and Budgeting and Financial Management for Nonprofits. She also wrote Follow the Money, Who Controls New York Mayors? And her latest book, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, The Limits of Power, has been called by a professor at New York University the most useful book on Bloomberg's policies to date. And he called it indispensable to anyone interested in the history of New York City in the 21st century. So that's high praise. And we're very happy to have Professor Lynne Weikart here. And I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you. So everybody go buy the book, but let me talk you into it. It's not a biography of Bloomberg. It doesn't talk a lot about his private life. I know nothing about his private life. I've never met the man. I'm all about looking at the data about what he did and his public policies. And I started out as I'm a fairly liberal progressive person, so I didn't particularly like him. So I started out with trying to be objective, but not really caring for him. As a matter of fact, I had a couple of debates about don't vote for this guy. Anyway, so I started researching him. And I'll tell you what I found in a couple of minutes, but let me just give you a background for those of you who don't know New York City. It's a huge city. It's over 8 million people. And it has 40% people foreign born. So there are just hundreds of languages there. It's a very cosmopolitan, very mixed. It's just an amazing place. You can walk down the street and hear a couple of different languages within one block. So, and it's 5 boroughs that each have their own distinct culture. And Manhattan is the borough that's sort of where people drive in or commute in to work and then go back to their boroughs. And for many years, I think Manhattan got most of the attention and the outer boroughs got very little. So it's a wonderful place to live. I just love New York City. And it's an exciting place to live. It's just between the culture and the universities and the people, it's much friendlier than you would realize if you've heard stories about New York City. I find New York City actually very friendly. So when Bloomberg came in, he came into a setting where Giuliani had just finished 2 terms of office. And Giuliani was a law and order man, and he was also an incredible racist. And one of the chancellors who worked for him after he left said he had never met an elected official who was so blatantly racist about people of color. And so what Giuliani established during those 2 years was a great deal of law and order, very little in terms of doing anything about making the bureaucracies work well, nothing about housing or homelessness, and a complete alienation from Blacks and Hispanic people. It was a very tense city. Just even if 9/11 hadn't happened, it was a very tense city. So 9/11 happens in September. And in November, first Tuesday in November, Bloomberg wins. And he has a month and a half to pull his people together and figure out what he's going to do. He didn't expect to win. But people were leery of electing Green, who was a typical liberal. and wanted someone who might know better how to deal with stuff, because Bloomberg came from the business world. So on January 1st, he was sworn in, and he gave this speech. He isn't known for his speech making, but he gave a pretty good speech. And in that speech, he talked about unity, about coming together, which no one expected to hear from him. And then he talked about how he was going to, how it was very important that we establish building a lot more jobs in the city and rebuilding the city, not just in Manhattan, but we have to pay attention to all 5 boroughs. It was a very solid speech, and it gave people an inkling of the kind of stability that Bloomberg brought to New York City. So one of the things you have to see with Bloomberg is that Bloomberg in those first few years was what I call a healer. He went around to all the churches and all the temples and all the mosques. He spent every weekend someplace, not in the Bahamas, but in the Black church or a temple or a mosque, talking to people about, don't give up on New York City. Don't leave, stay here. We're going to fix this. And we need unity, and we need you to come together, and we need to stop hating one another. And he did that throughout the city. People don't know the extent to which he traveled around talking to people, because they don't think of him as a great communicator. But for the first few years, he was actually quite a healer. And one of the things that really impressed me about Bloomberg, which I had no idea, was that he immediately said, stop saying things about Islam or Muslims. They did not cause 9/11. A bunch of terrorists caused 9/11. It's not about Islam. And he said that repeatedly, calmly, over and over again. He was a healer. And a few years after that, when a group of Muslims wanted to build a community center about 4 blocks from what was the World Trade Center, is now called Ground Zero. People objected, saying, we don't want Muslims so close to Ground Zero. And he immediately held a press conference. The first elected official, first one in the country, held a press conference and said, stop saying that. It was really gutsy. He said, all religions have an equal right to worship. Nowhere is off limits to any religion. He was just right out there. And then he talked to the reporters, and he just kept correcting them and correcting them. 2 days later, Obama came out and said something similar. But he really led the way. And I just really was so surprised, because I had no idea that Bloomberg was like that. And it was very impressive. So I see him first in the first few years as a healer. The second way I see him is as a planner. Bloomberg wasn't a politician. He was an electrical engineer. And one thing electrical engineers know how to do is to plan. They're taught planning. Now, politicians don't plan. Their staff do, but they don't. They're out there and neat and gritty. I was really struck by that once, many years ago, before Bloomberg, when Franz Leiter was running for state senate, and we were supporting Franz Leiter. And so we had on election day, his campaign was in my apartment, and his campaign manager was there all day and directing how this was going to happen. He had a great grassroots support. Leiter won. It was clear the campaign manager was the planner. And at one point, Leiter came in and was very worried because people were voting too much in a particular area, and he was worried about it. And the campaign manager said to him, he looked at his watch and said to him, "You're supposed to be in the 103rd Street subway platform passing out leaflets. What are you doing here?" And sent him away. And that struck me as politicians aren't planners. Politicians are there to get the votes. But Bloomberg wasn't a politician. He was a planner. And so that's what he did. He called in people from all over for different planning groups: education, economic development, the environment, the parks, you name it. He had a group. And they came up with suggestions. And he adopted some of those suggestions. And then, of course, as a manager, he planned to fulfill all of those suggestions because he was a top-notch manager. So he was a healer, he was a planner, and he was a manager. So he created this huge room where everyone sat right next to each other, including himself, so that he was very accessible. All of his staff could come up and talk to him. And he created a system of tables that were outside, but you could see them. So if you wanted to talk to him, you would, if you were a commissioner and you wanted to stop by and you knew his calendar, you knew the days he was going to be in his office, you would just come by and sit at one of the tables. You didn't have to make an appointment. And he would come by the tables. And a friend of mine was at one of those tables. He had come with the Center for Economic Opportunity, and he had come with an idea of how to count people in poverty different from where the federal government counted people in poverty, and it would be more accurate. And he wanted permission to do this. So he was sitting at this table, and the next table right next to him was the commissioner of police. So Bloomberg's coming around, he sits down with the commissioner of police, and my friend is watching. And they get in this huge argument, and they're shouting at one another. And my friend says, "I think I better leave." He's in a terrible mood. And so Bloomberg gets up from this. Finally, the commissioner leaves, stalks out, furious. And Bloomberg sort of gets up, sort of shakes it off, and walks over the table very pleasantly and says, "Hi, who are you?" And the Center for Economic Development director introduces them. And then my friend who's very nervous, gives him this spiel. He's an economist, he's an academic, and he gives him the spiel. And Bloomberg says, "That sounds like a really good idea." And then my friend says, "Well, to be honest, it means that we'll probably end up with a bigger count, and there will be more people in poverty by my count than by the federal government." And Bloomberg says, "That doesn't matter. It's data driven, right?" "Yes, it's very data driven." "Okay, let's do it." So as a manager, Bloomberg was very data driven. He hired good people regardless of patronage. He had since he was a billionaire, he didn't rely on political clubs to get himself elected. So he had no obligation to hire the Brooklyn machine or the Queens machine or the Bronx machine. He just hired good people. He was totally data driven about the decisions he should make. And he thought he should hold people accountable. And so those are all good management 101. The Achilles heel for Bloomberg was that he was very loyal to his people, so that if they were going off in the wrong direction, oftentimes he would not correct them. He would let them go. So when he had a deputy mayor like Dr. Roth, who was doing economic development and was building buildings from one end of the city to the other, but not enough affordable housing, even though they built 165,000 units of affordable housing. They needed more. Bloomberg didn't stop him and say, listen, let's sit down and figure this out. And how can we build more affordable housing? Bloomberg let him go, let him do his thing. And I think that's Achilles' heel for Bloomberg, was that he never said to his commissioners, it was very hard for him to say to his commissioners, stop, you're going in the wrong direction. Let's sit down and go through this and figure out another direction. He didn't do that. And he really believed in loyalty. If you were loyal to him, he was loyal to you. And that's not management 101. That's not good management 101. That's a mistake. And I think that hurt him. It hurt him a lot. Sometimes those of us who are pretty progressive relate all of this to, well, he didn't care. There are many ways that Bloomberg actually cared enormously, but that was his way of working. That had worked for him for 40 years before he got there. So it was hard for him to switch. And it never occurred to him to change. Loyalty to him was everything. So that's Bloomberg as a manager. And then there's Bloomberg as a crime fighter. He was very successful in keeping crime down, but the way he did it through Commissioner Kelly and the police department was stop and frisk. And that was seriously problematic, because you have basically a white police force stopping young Black and Puerto Rican people a lot more, especially young people, a lot more than white people. And Bloomberg didn't stop that. Even though he heard complaints about it, he didn't stop it. Part of that was this tremendous loyalty he had to his commissioners. And that was too far for me. I couldn't swallow that. I couldn't go along with that. I couldn't. But he would say that it was highly successful at the time. And maybe it was, I don't know, but there had to be another way. The judge who finally ruled against stop and frisk said that the whole stop and frisk was like burning down the house to get rid of the mice. There had to be another way. I'm not sure what that way is, but I thought I thought it's one of his real shortcomings. But in terms of the crime fighting, he did some things I had no idea he did. He was big on alternative detention, getting people out of the jails in some sort of alternative programs. He spent money in alternative programs for people in detention who did nonviolent crimes. They got out of prison and they were in alternative programs. The other thing he did was that our kids, and that from a young age, I think it was like 10 or 12, if they were accused of misdemeanors, oftentimes they were sent upstate to youth offender facilities. And those were shocking facilities. And they were clear upstate and the parents couldn't even visit. It was so far away. Or if they did visit, they got on buses and went forever to get there. It was and the facilities were known to be really miserable places. And these were kids, most of whom had just committed misdemeanors. So Bloomberg combined with the state to work to bring the kids home. And he succeeded. And they developed group homes throughout the city that would take the kids. They had more restrictive environments for kids that needed that, but otherwise they were in group homes, much closer where their parents could visit them. And I had no idea that Bloomberg did that. Some of the good things that he did have never been noticed. Then the other thing he did was, in terms of innovation, was he reorganized 3 areas of government. He reorganized economic development, he reorganized education, he reorganized health services. And everyone is fairly familiar with what he did in health services. When he hired Friedman, who later became head of CDC, they worked very closely together and did all sorts of wonderful things for public health in the city. He combined health and mental services together. He made big linkages between that, public health, and what was going on in the HHC and the hospitals. But more importantly, Bloomberg has enormous interest in public health, which he carried on today. And he made such a difference, not just in terms of smoking, but in terms of trans fat, what restaurants were putting into your food. It was impressive, and he was highly successful. In terms of economic development, he created a financial system that supported the development of affordable housing. What people forget is that when Bloomberg started, there was no system for building affordable housing because Giuliani never built any. He couldn't care less. It hadn't been built since Koch. Jenkins didn't build any, very few, because he had a huge deficit and recession, and he was completely snowed under by the recession. But Bloomberg had this opportunity and he took it, and he built a financial system so that there were pockets of money and that could be used for building affordable housing. So from scratch, he built 165,000 units of affordable housing. It wasn't enough. The homelessness during Bloomberg increased from 33,000 to 53,000. He was losing housing faster than he was building it. And that's one of the saddest parts about, I think, what happened in the Bloomberg administration. But we forget that he started with nothing. When the next mayor took over, the next mayor had this system in place that Bloomberg had put in place, and he had a lot of stuff in the pipeline. So they were able to build, I think they're up to 195,000 units of housing by the time Mayor de Blasio left. So, and this was all affordable housing as compared to market rate housing. So I think in terms of innovation, it was impressive. Education was another area where I was pretty furious with him, because begin with, he had a chancellor, Joe Klein, who knew nothing about education and was an antitrust litigator. That was Joel's expertise. And then I found through research and talking to people that the real reason he hired Joe Klein was because he wanted to take on the UFT contract. And he wanted somebody who was used to that rough and tumble of what went on with unions, and the whole antitrust was rough and tumble. But that wasn't education. And at first, what was going on with Joe Klein was just not very good. He tried to centralize everything and micromanage everything. He centralized security for the schools. He said he would take care of all school violence issues. And immediately, once you centralize security and the schools were no longer in charge of it, the violence rate in schools just tripled within a year. And then Joe Klein did something smart, which I will give him credit for, is that he went out and started looking for really good educators. And he found some. And he brought them in, and they gave him another plan. And that plan was, let's decentralize the schools and give schools more responsibility. Give schools more autonomy. Let them figure out how they're going to meet these standards. So one of the principals said to me, I went around and visited some of the principals, and one of the principals said to me, you know, it's like I run a bodega. And before Bloomberg came along, my bodega had all these rules and regulations, and I was going broke. It was terrible. And then Bloomberg came along, and now, you know what? It's my bodega. And I understand what he meant. It meant that he really got into it and could try and make changes, and no one would tell him no. And in that way, Bloomberg had some real success. He did graduate more people. More students graduated under Bloomberg. And more importantly, I think, more students got credit. So kids would go into high school, and they would be in the 9th grade, and they do so poorly, they had no credits. So they couldn't build up their credits to graduate. They were always seemed to be starting from zero. And when the decentralization happened and Bloomberg created all these small schools, the small schools were much more effective in dealing with the kids. And the kids started accumulating credits, which led to graduation rates rising. But in case anybody thinks that, oh, that was just a gift, that wasn't real serious. The other thing that happened was that more kids were passing the AP exams than ever before. So some of what Bloomberg did in education was really working. I still don't have any respect for Joe Klein and what he did, but the people around him were terrific. And I don't think Joe Klein understood sometimes some of the things that went on, but it really worked well. And when Joe Klein had a tendency to hire whoever he wanted to hire, and he paid no attention to the financial side, and Bloomberg got more and more disgruntled with his fiscal irresponsibility, and finally they agreed to part ways. Again, though, this is Bloomberg's Achilles heel. Bloomberg was not convinced that an educator could ever run the school system, that educators didn't understand how to manage something. So he went out and found someone else who was totally incapable of running the school system, Black, and she lasted like 3 months. So again, Bloomberg should have hired one of those educators and said, you're the deputy, I'm making you chancellor. But he didn't, because he couldn't get past some of his prejudices. And one of his prejudices was that educators didn't know how to run anything. And he couldn't have been more wrong. So Bloomberg, in effect, was his own worst enemy. But some of the things that went on in education were fabulous. The teacher's contract that Bloomberg negotiated in the first and second years of his administration, it was amazing. Over a period of 2 contracts, he got 150 additional minutes in the contract throughout the week. So that's 30 minutes a day, longer. Nobody ever talks about this, but that's what happened. In exchange, he gave huge salary increases, particularly to new teachers. So they went from in 2002, their new teachers were being paid $31,000. And a few years later, they were paying $46,000. He just gave them huge increases. He wanted better teachers, and he knew how to get them, pay them well. He really believed pay people well. now the senior teachers are making over 100,000 a year. The teachers in New York City are some of the highest paid teachers in the country. It doesn't mean that he did everything right, because I don't think he did in education, but that was amazing. The other thing he did was, in some teachers' contract, was not just the 150 minutes, but principals were allowed to choose their deputies, the deputy principal. Before, they weren't allowed to choose. So in the contract, he got the principals could choose the deputies. Now it wouldn't occur to you that a principal couldn't choose his deputies, but that's the way it was. He got rid of that. Principals could not choose the teachers to come into their school. They had to take them from a list, and it was seniority only. That stopped, that ended. Principals could choose the teachers. They could interview them and pick the ones that were. So in that way, some of the things he did in the union contract, they're still with us today. They were terrific. It meant that you could choose the best teacher and not the most senior teacher. It was just wonderful. But he really had a limit, and he wouldn't listen to parents. He ignored them. Politicians would not necessarily listen to parents, but they would not ignore them. He wasn't very political in terms of his responses. And one of his biggest Achilles heels is he would say things that would just disturb people. He was on the radio every weekend. And one weekend, someone asked him about parents' involvement. And he said, I don't think parents sometimes understand how involved they should be with their kids' education. So they're just not there. I don't know what it is. I don't know. Maybe they don't have any education. And he went on to disparage parents. I mean, it was just awful. So there's a part of Bloomberg that was just his own worst enemy. And I had one of the people I interviewed who was an advocate, wasn't part of the administration, said, there's all these good things that Bloomberg did, but he always managed to say things that really just alienated people. And I think that's true. Those were his shortcomings. But innovation was there. And particularly there in the environment, particularly there in health. It was, and in parks, it was incredible. I'm talking too long, but let me just say a couple other places. The other place he was really good at was in budgeting and in finance, which you would expect, right? You would expect him to be good at this, and he was. He had 3 months, well, 2.5 months to prepare himself to talk about New York City's budget. And he did. In 2.5 months, he stood up before a huge press conference and talked about what his executive budget, a projected budget, a suggested budget that he was giving to the city council would be. He spent an hour and a half without any notes talking about the budget, pointing out things with a PowerPoint in the background. It was impressive. He understood it. And his first budget was really problematic because they were in such a hole. They only had about a $42 billion budget for the city, and he had a $5 billion deficit. $2.5 billion was from Giuliani, and $2.5 billion was from 9/11. Giuliani left the city flat broke with all the contracts expired. All the labor union contracts were expired. So Bloomberg was forced to, with a deficit, to deal with getting contracts signed. And that's when he succeeded in getting productivity increases and a big salary boost. So how does he balance his budget? Well, at first, he has a real issue. It's an election year for the governor. The governor is Pataki. It's the same party as Bloomberg. Bloomberg ran on the Republican line. Pataki says to Bloomberg, I'm not raising taxes. Don't ask me for taxes. Whatever you do, don't even ask to raise taxes. Because the state controls our tax system. Except for the property tax. We have to go to the state and ask for increases. So Bloomberg said, okay, I won't ask. And so he had to wait till November. So what he proposed were budget cuts, more state and federal aid, and he proposed borrowing. And this is where Bloomberg was really quite helpful, that he was from Wall Street. People in Wall Street in the financial sector had enormous respect for Bloomberg. And Bloomberg said, I need to borrow money for operating costs. And that's a no-no in New York City. That's been a no-no since the 1975 fiscal crisis. It's against the law to borrow money against operating costs more than 100 million. And he wanted $1 billion. And they gave it to him. I don't think anybody else could have gotten it from them, but he got it. He got a $1 billion borrowing because they had enormous respect for what he was doing. So that was impressive as well. And after November, he announced, by the way, we have a deficit. Everyone who's a policymaker in New York City knew there was a deficit, but he managed to get his way until November and said, we have a deficit. Governor's been reelected. We need to charge taxes, change our tax structure. So I suggest an income tax increase. And the state legislature in Pataki said, no, we're not doing an income tax increase. And that's the most progressive thing he could have done, but the state would not agree. So Bloomberg said, okay, we're going to a property tax increase of 25%. And everybody went nuts in the city. And finally, he talked the city council into 18.5%. So in order to get us out of our hole, we increased the property tax by 18.5%. And again, he really worked the city council. And this is a guy who wasn't a politician, who wasn't the kind of person who knew how to make deals with politicians, but he knew how to deal with money, and he knew how to persuade people about money. And that's what he did. So he got us out of a financial hole, very well done. And he ended in 12 years of his administration, 10 of them ended in surpluses, only 2 years in deficit. And that's 9/11, that's the 2008 recession, that's Hurricane Sandy, only 2 years of deficits, everything else, and that's those first 2 years. Everything else, he ended in a surplus. So he had, when it came to budgeteering, he really knew what he was doing. Now, we can't ignore the fact that he was a billionaire. So that insulated him from political pressures. He didn't have to listen to politicians. He wasn't a part of the Brooklyn machine, nothing like that. He ended patronage that went on in the city in many ways. And all of these things are things that I never knew, even though I'm very, very knowledgeable about the city. We used to have, because I worked under the Koch administration at one point, we used to have personnel files in the basement of City Hall. And if a commissioner wanted to hire somebody, then we had all these personnel files from all the political clubs and the machines of Brooklyn and Queens and Bronx, Staten Island, where we would suggest, look at this person, look at that person. And that existed until Bloomberg. And Bloomberg said, get rid of all that stuff. I don't want to see it. Tell the commissioners to hire the best people. And I don't want them hiring from the political clubs. And so he didn't even bother getting, very rarely, once in a while, he wanted somebody hired. But on the whole, he let his commissioners do the hiring. And that was impressive. The other thing he did was, we used to have a mayor's advisory committee on the judiciary. So that if you wanted, if you wanted to be a judge, you had to go before an advisory committee made up of the top lawyers and convince them that you're well qualified. And you would come out of that, we called it a panel. You would come out of that panel, and if you came out as selected, then you were in a pool of people that could run for office. Otherwise, you couldn't run for office or you couldn't be appointed. Giuliani threw that out. Bloomberg brought it back. Then the other one that he disbanded and was the one I had heard about but didn't really know the details. Giuliani had established a decency commission. I love that. And it was to pass judgment on questionable works of art that municipal museums might wish to buy. And there was a huge debate about this when Brooklyn Museum bought a very questionable piece of art. And Bloomberg threw that out. He renamed the commission the Cultural Advisory Commission. And their new mission was to provide awards in the arts. Nothing about judging decency. So, and then there's Ground Zero, where Bloomberg had been shut out of Ground Zero because the governor Pataki had taken it over. It was his baby. He wanted credit for it. The problem was that it was a very difficult situation with who owned what. There were private developers involved, and they couldn't come to agreement about anything. And the families of those who had died, almost 2,700 people, the families of those who had become a very powerful force, and the families could not agree. And Pataki was going crazy, and this went on for a few years. And finally, Pataki turned to Bloomberg and said, "Can you help me?" And Bloomberg said, "Yes, how can I help?" And he said, "Well, could you be in charge of getting the families to agree to some architectural plans, because we're going nuts here?" And he said, yes. So Bloomberg took on the most difficult task. And he got his right-hand person, Patricia Harris, and they met with the families. It was months. Every day, every week, they were meeting and talking through it. And they came to agreement, so that when people say to me, Bloomberg wasn't much of a communicator, I go, no. The man could communicate. It's true, he doesn't give great speeches, that's true. But you put him in a room with a group of people, he can communicate. And he saved Pataki's hide in Ground Zero. And there's a wonderful book out about Ground Zero. And it was a book I've forgotten, but if I think of it, I'll tell Jocelyn to let you know. It was just fabulous. And it gave a very poignant description of what went on there between all the different politicians. So those are the different pieces of Bloomberg that I think were so fascinating, that I found that most of them I didn't know before I saw them. It got me to the point where, although I'm not convinced I would vote for him, but I have a lot of respect for him that I didn't have before. And then the last piece, I guess I would say, and then we'll open it up to questions, is because I'm a professor and I could talk for 2 or 3 hours, so I'm not going to do that. Is just, let's talk about state and federal for a minute. And that is that one of the things Bloomberg said very early to one of the reporters was that I'm really shocked, he said. First of all, I didn't realize how good people were in government. I didn't realize how competent they were, how well educated they were. It's amazing. I love working with these people. And then he said, the second thing is I didn't realize I had no control. Now remember, the New York mayor is a very powerful mayor. But when it comes to what the state does, the state controls the city. And Bloomberg said, I'm amazed. And he's used to running his own company. He's used to the fact he had control, but he doesn't. He wanted to increase the number of cameras next to streetlights. You cannot increase the number of cameras in this city without getting permission from the state legislature. It's ridiculous. We don't have control over our tax system. We can't increase the sales tax, the property tax, the sales tax, the income tax. We can't change the way the property tax is structured without permission from the state. All we can do is increase the property tax uniformly across all 4 categories, but we can't change the structure at all. It goes on like that. Some of the things that happened with the homeless and with housing was all the state. The state, for example, is the one that if you're in a rent stabilized building and you have a repair problem, you have to go to the state and file a complaint. And it takes at least 10 months. I mean, the amount of control the state has, both in regulation and in property. They own Ground Zero. They own most of Times Square. There's so much that they owned. So it really surprised Bloomberg. And there's some wonderful stories in the book about how he dealt with it, sometimes successfully and sometimes not so successfully. But why don't I stop now, because I've been ranting now for almost an hour, and we can open it up for questions.
I forgot to unmute. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. People can write their questions in the chat or just raise your hand. Any questions? L Gentile, you can unmute, and you have to unmute though. Yeah.
Hi. So I've read the book. It's a great book. And you really took Mayor Bloomberg to task over stop and frisk.
Yeah.
And when you see what happened in the debates, it seemed to me that between his, not doing a great job as a public speaker in the debates and people really criticizing him for stop and frisk, that sort of seemed to me to be the end of his candidacy. And so I was curious to know what you thought. And by the way, I want to say, I would vote for him every day if I could, by the way. But I was wondering, am I correct that Mayor Adams is talking about bringing back some form of stop and frisk, and what your thoughts are about that? Yeah. I'll take your answer off the air.
It's a difficult one. Because I do agree with the judge that said it's like burning down the house to get rid of the mice. The problem really is that in the areas of, in the poverty areas, whether it's black or white, in the poverty areas, job rates are still pretty low. Jobs are increasing, but not necessarily in the poverty areas. So you've got a lot of people who are very satisfied. So that's one issue. So to go back to stop and frisk, it would have to be done very carefully so that we aren't just stopping people of color, and particularly youth. I mean, you have to stop everybody, but there's a certain amount of accuracy in that. If the word gets out that the police are going to stop and frisk, people stop carrying guns because they don't want to be caught with a gun. So they stop carrying them. But you have to remember that people are carrying guns because they're scared. That's why most people are carrying guns. They're scared. And so that it's a tough thing to do. And in a way, Adams may have strategies that might be very useful because he has this background in law and order. But the guns are being carried not out of, for the most part, because people are afraid that they're going to get shot walking down the street trying to get to work. So it's I don't have any easy answers for it, but I don't want to go back to my son's friends getting thrown around by the cops, which is what happened, because they're people of color, whereas my son was not. And I don't know how to navigate that. But maybe you're right. Maybe I would vote for him.
It looks like Carol Tiernan has a question. Do you want to unmute Carol and ask?
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed listening to you and I look forward to reading your book. I just wonder, I live in the West Village and I just wondered what happened to St. Vincent's. It seems like he gave it away to the Rudins and now it's worth, you know, probably billions of dollars in co-ops. So what happened?
Well, he did that around the city. He did that around the city. And I think that's one of the criticisms that people had, was that as far as Bloomberg was concerned, if he could create very market-driven buildings throughout the city, throughout Manhattan, then you would have a situation where a lot of tax revenues would be coming into the city that would pay for a lot of other things. So he would defend that to the death. Of course, we want market rate housing. We don't need St. Vincent's. We've got too many hospitals as it is. And he really went after market rate housing, developing it around the city. And he succeeded in building our revenues. It's incredibly rich city today, and a city that has a much better budget because he was fairly frugal when it came to the agencies. He was very insistent that they be productive, and he cut the agency's staffing to keep the number of city employees down to a reasonable number. But I do think he was right that at the time, there were just too many hospitals.
Wait, not downtown.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Beth Israel isn't that far away.
Yeah, it's on the east side.
Yeah, but the east side and the village is not that far away, right?
Yeah, no, it is pretty far away with
Right.
traffic and everything, but thank
Right.
you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? You can use the chat if you want. It looks like, is David Gentile asking a question?
No. Okay. All right. Can you see? Let's see. Sorry, we're like sharing. There we go. Hey, Lynn. Great job. I love this. Hey, I love the stories that you told. Really interesting. I'm curious if you were to look back at, Bloomberg's 3 terms, and you think about what you would see as maybe his lasting legacy, something that you would say, years from now, people are going to be able to attribute to him and we carry forward. What would that be?
Oh, there's so many. The first there's the environment. The environment was. I'm getting an echo. Are you getting an echo?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to stop that. Let me see if I can do something.
Susanna, what do we do?
I think you're good now.
Okay. Susanna's or David's here. David, tell us what to do. There's so many things. One is some of the environmental work that he did. He created several plans that he then started implementing, and they're still in implementation phase today, to protect the city from rising waters. And some of that has already been done and is continuing. Like I'm not much of an environmentalist, but like the grasslands and all of the stuff that goes on that doesn't require big dikes are the kinds of things that are being done today because of him. So the environmental piece is one, I think. The parks, the parks is amazing. You can go all the way around Manhattan now, but the parks happen. What he did was he said, we have 8 regional parks and I'm going to fix them. And he did a beautiful job. And then he went on to other parks. He used to be criticized for not paying attention to the little parks. And he would say, give me a break. The idea is, let's first invest our resources in the big parks where so many people use them. And then we go out. But he actually did hundreds of parks. And the million trees and the painting the roofs white, all the environmental stuff that he did, I think, and the plans he left behind to make it all happen is something that will always be remembered. He will always be a controversial figure because of all the market rate housing and luxurious housing that he built, but because it changed Manhattan so dramatically. There was a certain amount of gentrification that went with that, and people being pushed out of the neighborhoods. But the waterfront is now accessible. That was never accessible before. All of that made New York a much more livable city. So many things he'll be remembered for, but that's certainly one of them.
Lynn, John Kenny here. I'm a native New Yorker. I really enjoyed your comments. I've worked pretty closely with Bloomberg's company. I've been pretty impressed over the years of just how competent the people are there. Very, very innovative. I think he did bring some of that to running New York. I miss him right now. I think a lot of New Yorkers miss him right now.
Oh yeah.
We've had 5 cops shot year to date. We've had a number of people pushed in the subway. I think we were up to 30 people last year pushed onto the subway tracks in 1 year. I was on the 72nd Street subway 3 nights ago at Broadway, and I almost took a picture. I could see the entire platform, as long as you could see, had people standing back from the platform, pretty crowded at the time, all the way back into the middle of the platform, because people are very concerned about being pushed onto the tracks. Something I've never seen before, quite frankly. Having conversations with 81-year-old women about making sure they stand next to columns when they get on the subway. Sort of as bad as the 70s were growing up there, and sometimes during the 80s, I've never had conversations like this before. I do think, to your point, that he overplayed some of the stop and frisk. But what's going on now lately is, I think, concerning to a lot of New Yorkers, especially Black and Hispanic New Yorkers who pretty much elected Adams. I think that's the consensus.
Yeah.
Who I do think, to your point earlier, is bringing a more measured view of things. He was clearly someone that was very much, on record opposed to a lot of what NYPD did back in the day, but also has been very much out front and center trying to counter some of the challenges that are out there right now. It's palpable. This murder down in Chinatown the other day is a topic of conversation in my office for the handful of people that are still going in, by the way. And also the woman who was a Deloitte employee who was thrown on the tracks and killed at Times Square, if I'm not mistaken, during the day, was also a topic of conversation for employees that I work with who are from Chinatown, by the way. So I'm curious, as an educator, the most innovative thing I thought he did was the Cornell Tech situation out in initiative out in Roosevelt Island, which I thought was unbelievably innovative and might really lead to some jobs. I'm not sure if that's getting traction. I'm in tech, by the way, so I haven't actually seen that really get traction yet, but I'm curious as to what you thought about that.
Oh, one of the pieces I should have talked about was Bloomberg made this linkage between schools and tech. He promoted the tech sector. So now that we're third, there's Boston, there's California, and there's us. I mean, the tech sector has grown dramatically in this town, and it's because of Bloomberg. He created Roosevelt Island, which was Cornell University and the Israeli University together. And it's an incredible educational tour de force for high tech at Roosevelt Island. He created Columbia's Institute of Data Series. He created one of the Cornell going down to, there was one in Brooklyn. It's just, there were 4 major university complexes that he created that linked tech to higher education. And then he linked schools to higher education. And that was impressive. So he created a school where the kids went to the high school, they got 2 years of community college, and they went to work for IBM. When Bloomberg started, there were only 12 career and technical schools in the city. When he left, there were 46. It was just, and that's one of Bloomberg's big commitments is to the youth. He created a program just for Black and Puerto Rican men, boys, youth, and the conservatives went nuts. They were just furious. How can you do this? And he goes, get over it. And he created this program where they would be given special support to get through CUNY. And it was an accelerated program with lots of support, daycare support, all tuition, all fees paid, and a social worker to help them find housing if they didn't have housing. So he got a whole, and he's continued to do this. And one of the big things about Bloomberg that I just love is what he continues today is that commitment to youth. He pays thousands and thousands of kids to go to college who are from families who didn't have a college education person and the first generation to go to college. Thousands. And he does that today. It's very impressive. He did a lot of work with youth in this city that isn't recognized. Liberals in particular never wanted to give him any credit. And they ignored all the good things that he did. And I'm a liberal. I was just as guilty as everybody else before I started looking at it.
Continuing on with what you were talking about, there's a question about what Bloomberg has done since he left office.
Oh, well, I agree with him and I don't agree with him. He's big on charter schools and I'm not. I just don't think that if you can have charter schools that are not regulated. I think that if you're going to have small schools, that's fine. But if you're going to have a charter school, they must be part of the school district. I just don't like these unregulated charter schools That's like, that's nuts. Anyway, so he's doing that. But he's doing two other things that are really phenomenal. One is his investment in youth, and the other is his investment in cities. He created a program with Harvard where they bring in mayors from all over the country to talk to one another, exchange information, learn about the latest things that are going on in cities. And then he created a program where mayors could apply for an innovative grant. Wonderful. And you could get an innovative grant of like $5 or $10 million if you won to start this program, whatever you want to start. And that's been going on now since 2014, I think he started. And that innovation is amazing. And Bloomberg has committed himself to cities can make a difference. And that includes environmental stuff. So between his environmental work and his cities work and his youth work, he's just making, he will be just as much remembered for what he did afterwards as what he did when he was here in New York.
Another question. What is your next book?
I don't know if I have one more in me, but if I do, it would be how we lost in 1975. We lost, New York City lost. We lost control. And the corporate elites and the state officials took over. And they've controlled us ever since.
Mm.
And the difference is, what difference does a mayor make in that kind of scenario? And I think mayors can make a difference in that kind of scenario. So that's what I'm thinking of doing. And that's what I've been playing with and talking to people about.
Another question. Susanna says, my recollection is that he was very supportive of hiring women in his administration. Do you find that to be true?
Oh yeah, the women I talked to in his administration, Bloomberg was just wonderful. He treated everyone with a great deal of respect. He really didn't. He really didn't have much of a temper most of the time. But women in particular loved working for Bloomberg. Not only did he never hit on anyone, he just wouldn't tolerate anything like that. I thought it was really unfortunate when he was accused of that kind of thing. He came out of Wall Street, and Wall Street is particularly known for that kind of predator. And I'm sure during those times in Wall Street, he said things he shouldn't have said. But as mayor of New York City, he was exemplary, absolutely exemplary. And women love working for him because he's just so good about it.
Laura wants to know if he can bring a bike lane to Shelter Island.
Right, we should get him to buy a house here.
And any other questions? That was so informative. I feel like I know so much more and understand Bloomberg so much better than I did before the book and hearing this talk. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
And anyone,
fun.
just another applause. Thank you everyone for coming, and best of luck with the success of the book, Professor Weikart. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night,
everybody.
everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thanks
you
for
very
coming.
much. Yep.
Thank you.
It was fun.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Jocelyn.
Bye.
Thanks, Jocelyn.
Bye.